Hello, everyone. I'm Liz Stein, and I have the pleasure of working on communications and public relations for South by Southwest EDU. We are so excited to see so many of you here today for South by Southwest EDU Online. The conversation today is going to be a powerful one. It's titled Eliminating Barriers to Economic Opportunities. Our speakers today will discuss the current statistics around those living in poverty and how dedicated funding for all phases of the learning life cycle can help eliminate barriers to economic opportunity. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ramona Schindelheim and Wes Moore for this incredible conversation.
Thank you, Liz. I'm Ramona Schindelheim, Editor-in-Chief of WorkingNation. We're a nonprofit media company focused on the future of work, the future of education, and importantly, telling stories about programs that can help upskill workers so they can get good jobs in America. I'm honored to be virtually sitting here next to Wes Moore, the CEO of Robinhood. Robinhood is a New York-based nonprofit that has spent the past 30 years plus finding, fueling, and creating scalable, impactful solutions to lift families out of poverty. Robinhood has partnered with more than 250 nonprofits to support food, housing, legal services, and importantly, especially now during COVID-19, education and workforce development programs. Wes, I'm thrilled to have you here with us.
I'm so thrilled to be here with you. Saying my only regret is that we're not sitting in Austin having this conversation, but it's great to be with you, and I'm just such a huge fan of South by and South by Southwest EDU and this work. So it's a real pleasure.
Well, maybe we can make that happen next year. So we'll see if we can do that. Before we get into talking about the broader issue, I do want to give people some background and talk a little bit about what brought you to the place you are now in your history. Yeah. So you've had a very accomplished adult life. You're a combat veteran who served in Afghanistan. You're an entrepreneur. You're an author, a Rhodes Scholar. But your childhood in Baltimore was really much different. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like when you were growing up?
Yeah, it's I always say to understand who I am, it's important to understand that I am the result of and the child of activists and ministers and teachers and storytellers.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think about how all that kind of helped to shape and influence who I am. I mean, the first memory, and I only have two memories of my father. And the second memory that I have of him was when I was about 4 years old and I watched him die in front of me. And he died actually because of an illness that was misdiagnosed, where he went to a hospital and was told, and my mother was asked questions like, is he prone to exaggeration? There was an assumption that he didn't have insurance. He was sent home and with instructions to rest, and if it gets worse, come back to the hospital. And he died hours after getting back to the house. And so I remember that moment and how I even think it reflects to this moment where we find ourselves right now, where, how many people and children who now have to share that same fate that I then had to, which is basically growing up with my mother, then, raising 3 children on her own. And that was not the life that she had prepared for or the life that she had expected. We then moved up to the Bronx to go live with my grandparents. My grandfather was a minister in the South Bronx. My grandmother was a school teacher for 29 years in the South Bronx. And I was, I was the type of kid that, that frankly, I spent a lot of time hurting people that actually did love me, so I could impress people that could care less about me. Where, by the time I was 11 years old was the first time that I felt handcuffs on my wrists. By the time I was 13, I was sent away to a military school because I was asked to leave my prior school. And so when I think about the progression that I had throughout life, What it really was a series of people who, frankly, in many ways saw something in me before I was even prepared to see it in myself. And were willing to fight and advocate and give second chances and third chances and fourth chances, but who were willing to actually create a pathway for something different, and in some ways something unseen. Because I think now about the things that I've been able to see and experience and do. It's not like I'm walking through steps that my family had stepped in before. These were steps that they envisioned, but it wasn't places that they had been. And that's when I think about this work that we do. When I think about the importance of being able to establish and craft a vision of equity and opportunity, I do that from a very personal place, because I feel like that's all that I was given, was just a chance and a space and a place where opportunity could actually meet ambition, and for people to actually shape what ambitions actually look like and what ambitions actually could be. And so I'm, I remember I was actually speaking with my daughter, I did the first book I wrote was called The Other Wes Moore. I did a young adult version of it, and she actually just finished reading the young adult version. She's 8, and we were talking about it, and she was telling me how she felt bad that I had to experience so many of those things as a child, because that was the first time we actually had a conversation about my childhood. And my response to her was, don't feel bad, because it's what makes me who I am. The thing I think that we have to ensure, all of us, is that the things that I had that helped me, the vision and frankly the luck, that shouldn't have to be a prerequisite for people. And that's really how we drive this work.
So Wes, you talk about in The Other Wes Moore, you talk about how small decisions, and you mentioned role models, small decisions make all the difference. What was a turning point for you? What connected you to the adult you, your adult sensibilities?
I think one of the biggest things that happened to me was when leadership was introduced into my life. And I say that because when people say what was the benefit for the military or military school for me, like, was it waking up early, or was it getting yelled at, or was it doing push-ups? I mean, you're going to do all that. You're going to wake up early, you're going to do push-ups, you're going to be yelled at, right? Got it. Par for the course, default factor, just put it in. That's not what makes the difference, though, right? The thing that helped me most was when I actually got put in charge of something. And it's very intentional, but they do it, and they put you in charge of something small at first, right? They put you in charge of something small because, that's the way you're going to start. And they're going to put you in charge of a small group or a small unit, or even just an assignment, right? Your job is to clean up that hallway. And if the hallway is clean, we'll congratulate you. If the hallway is dirty, then Lord help you. And they give you that responsibility. And then they start noticing you do that pretty well. And then you graduate, right? You get promoted. Now you're in charge of a squad. And then you do that pretty well. And they realize that the squad is performing well because you're in charge. And then you get promoted, right? It's this graduated sense of responsibility that we then have. One of the things that was really fascinating to me when I hear people talk about how complicated, things like gangs and drug organizations are. And my answer to them is they're not. They're actually not complicated at all. You know what I mean? Because it's like, in many ways, it's a carbon copy of the model that is then put together for how these military organizations get, or any Fortune 500 company, where when you start off in a drug organization, you don't start as a kingpin. They give you a little job, and you do that pretty well, and you get promoted, and you get promoted, and you get promoted. And so the point behind all of that is that there is this graduated sense of responsibility that I think people have, and people have to understand and appreciate for the way this goes. The thing that happened to me was leadership was introduced into my life. And then it became something that I didn't just rely on, but I sought out. And I feel like for so many of our kids, they are alphas, right? Our boys and our girls, they're looking for responsibility, looking to be noticed. They're looking to be seen. They're looking for something bigger. And what happened at some point was I just found something that was going to take me in a positive direction that allowed me to get that. Because if not, you would have gotten it. You just would have gotten it from someplace else, and you would have gotten through another venue. And that's where that divide, I think, started to happen.
Well, now you're leading Robin Hood Foundation, and you're in a position where you can help fund programs, whether it's education or workforce development, that gives people these skills. I want to get into some of those programs in a minute, but first, when you and I first started talking last year before we were going to do South by Southwest, it was a very different world than the one that we're in now. So I wanted to share some statistics with everyone. They may have seen some of these before, but I'd like to share them just to kind of set the stage on where we are at when it comes to poverty, where we're at when it comes to unemployment, and what could be lying ahead. So allow me to share my screen. Everyone, here we go. So from the beginning, there we go. Right now, poverty in America, as you can see on the screen, 39 million people live below the poverty line. And for a family of four, that's $27,000 a year for a family of four. So that's 12.4% of our country. And another 93.6 million people, 30% of the people, live near the poverty line. They're about one paycheck away from financial difficulties. And then, as we all know, COVID-19 has created a vast problem with employment in the country. Over 33 million people filing claims. Jobless rate jumped to 14.7% in April. And the real jobless rate, which is a number that the BLS actually does track, and that's people who are working part-time because they can't get full-time work. That also includes people who have not looked for work because they've just given up. They've become discouraged. That's almost 1 in 4 people in the country, which is an amazing number. And then a new study out by Columbia University Center on Poverty and Social Policy fears that more and more people can be pushed into poverty because of lasting, sustained unemployment. And just the best case scenario, 10% unemployment, poverty rate will go to 15%. I think those are like remarkably devastating numbers that we need to start addressing. And I know that's part of what you're doing with Robin Hood, looking at, and I'd like to talk first about children. So you're looking at programs trying to help children. 1 in 3 of those people who are in poverty now are children. And education would play a big role in helping them moving forward. So maybe talk a little bit about the kind of programs that you're looking for.
Yeah, it's and I think some of the most heartbreaking things about what you just mentioned, Ramona, in some of those stats is not just their reality; it's that they're remarkably predictable. One of the most heartbreaking things about poverty is our level of toleration of it. The fact that we don't have to exist. Our society does not have to exist with the kind of poverty levels that we have. We have chosen to. We have made a fundamental choice as a society of how much poverty are we willing to tolerate. How much pain are we willing to tolerate in our neighbors as long as it doesn't too significantly impact ourselves.
I think it's very invisible.
Well, what's fascinating is it's not invisible if we open our eyes to it, right? So I tell people all the time that I can guarantee you, and this is pre-COVID-19, pre-home isolation, right? You were interacting with people every single day who were living in poverty, and you just didn't even know it, or didn't click that person was living in poverty. So sometimes people think of the person living in poverty like, well, the person who's sleeping on the grate, right? That person sleeping on the grate, yes, person living in poverty. But do you know who also could have been living in poverty? The person who was serving you coffee that morning. The person who when you finished your meal, was picking up the trash or washing the dishes. If you stayed in a hotel, the person who was changing your sheets. Or if you had to go to the hospital, the orderly. We have to, one of the most heartbreaking statistics in all of this that we see is that 22% of people who have lost their jobs during COVID-19 were in poverty before. So think about what I just said. 22% of people who lost their jobs since COVID-19 were in poverty before, i.e., this was the working poor. These were people who have jobs. many cases, multiple jobs, and are still living below the poverty line. And so some of the most heartbreaking things that we're seeing here is the impact that that then has when COVID-19 didn't just introduce something new, it exposed something broken.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about it in my own case. The first time my mother got a job that gave her benefits was when I was 14 years old. The first time she got a job that paid her enough that she only had to work one job was 14 years old. The first time she got a job that gave her regular hours was when I was 14 years old. 14 years old is a very important year for me because of what happened to my mom. And it ended up changing the trajectory for not just me, but changing the trajectory for my entire family. 14 years old. And so when we talk about what are the impacts that this is having on our children, part of the impact that this is having on our children is the fact that so many of the hopes and dreams of our kids are being lifted up by their parents and their guardians. We know that people will sacrifice if it means I'm willing to sacrifice for my child. We know that there's nothing we will not do for our children, nothing we will not do for our family, nothing we will not do to be able to support those that we love. But when you're sacrificing into a void, it doesn't feel like sacrifice anymore. It just feels like suffering. And so what we watch now with COVID-19 is as these dynamics have continued to change, the shred of hope that people have been holding on to is now feeling increasingly frayed. And that becomes the issue, and that becomes the challenge that people are having with where we are right now.
The food insecurity, the housing insecurity, the job insecurity for the parent, that does play on a child's psyche. But there's also the fact that, so because of COVID-19, schools have been out and kids are at home. And for a lot of those kids, their one hot meal of the day may come from the schools.
Yes, that's right. And, and people, it is important for people to realize and understand that when we're talking about what do schools do, these are not just the place that kids are getting their educational supports, right? Our schools are also the largest food provider for our children in this country. Our schools are also the largest health provider and healthcare provider for kids in our country. They are the largest mentorship programs and after school programs for kids in our society. And so when we're shutting down school buildings, it's not just about the fact that it's not just about reading and writing and arithmetic and can a teacher sit in front of a class and provide instruction. It's all the other things that the educational environment and the educational push gives to all of our children. And we think about what the impact is of the closing of schools and what that has had on our children. It is about the fact that for many of our children, the place that they were relying on for sustainable food supports is school, and we now have to come with an alternative for that. It's also about the fact that how closing up this system for some kids, it means they need to find alternative ways of learning. They need to work on remote learning. They need to figure out how they're going to get their lessons online. But we also have a reality where about a quarter of our kids have not logged on once. They don't have the basic mechanisms, either universal access to Wi-Fi or the tangible technologies to be able to make sure that they're actually able to not just keep up, but thrive within this educational environment. We put a lot of funding and a lot of work into the challenge of summer learning loss. And summer learning loss is real. For everybody who's watching this, watching this webcast, you all know the challenge of what happens to students, for many students, between the months of June and the months of September is staggering. And oftentimes it can take until November to catch up where a student left off when that student, was left off in June. What happens if it's no longer June? What happens if we're now talking about February, that we've had a child in a place of a sustainable educational environment? We're talking about children now who essentially could potentially lose up to a year of educational attainment. We're talking about children who right now, where we could watch a doubling of the achievement gap, which was already far too big and already far too vast. And so how we think about that when it comes to our recovery packages, when it comes to our support systems, how we're thinking about everything from the whole holistic training, from early childhood learning to the K-12 system, to that transition into higher education, all these things have to get thought and rethought, particularly as we're talking about the ways we're going to adapt our society in this post-COVID-19 world.
Are you working with any government agencies at all to talk about this? Any local government? I know you're based in New York, but you do also work. Some of your programs are funded around the country.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things that happened when we think about the things that we've really pushed and initiated since I've been the CEO of Robinhood, one of which is Robinhood's really first integrated national initiative called Mobility Labs, which really works to identify, and we've identified 9 different communities around the country with an exclusive focus on looking at sustainable economic mobility. And so they've included communities in Maryland, communities in New York, communities in Illinois, communities in the Bay Area, and communities in Pennsylvania, and looking at urban, rural, and suburban poverty, and how exactly can we change and alter urban and rural and suburban poverty in kind of in a holistic fashion. The way we're continuing to look at that in this way really becomes this. We understand that working with governmental entities is not important, it's imperative. It's the only way we're actually going to be able to adjust and to adapt and to create the larger challenge, to address the larger challenges that we're facing, because frankly, philanthropy and lack thereof, or whatever the case might be, is not the reason we have so many structural challenges. The reason we have so many structural challenges have been because of governmental policies and initiatives. So therefore, for our work to be effective, it means we have to be able to integrate and push our work with a core focus on helping and working with government, using our capital to be catalytic, but really working with government to address some of the structural challenges and some of the structural divides that still very much exist within our society. And so whether it's on the framework of education, whether it's on the framework of housing, whether it's on the framework of mental and physical health, or immigration policies, or criminal justice reform, all of these things, all of these assets are things that we work through and work deliberately on to make sure that we can address, and that government is a crucial partner in being able to address all these things.
And one of the things that you tend to focus on, or you have focused on in education, is that getting those the kids from high school, post-secondary education, making sure that they graduate. You recently, or you have funded the Lehman College ACE program.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the ACE program, and it's a fantastic program. So ACE actually stands for Accelerate, Complete, and Engage. And Lehman College is actually it's in the Bronx, and it's the only public 4-year college in the Bronx. Half of their students come from backgrounds where they're making less than $30,000 a year. And so really what ACE is, and what ACE does, it really examines and explores the reality of why we had so many students who would start school but not finish. And we know that, when people say that college or higher education of some way, shape, or form is really the springboard to economic stability, that's only partially true. Higher education completion is the springboard to economic stability. And so the completion part is the crucial component that for many people they were missing. And when you're looking at the fact that for many schools around the nation, for our community colleges, that the completion rate is in the teens, that we have to be able to think through and address what are the challenges that students are facing, and how do we make sure that we're both bolstering up the institutions but also supporting the students in that way. And there's a collection of different reasons why a student could have difficulty matriculating. For some students, it's academic, right? So when you consider the fact that we have students who oftentimes will start higher education and will require a whole battery of developmental coursework. And so the developmental coursework is the coursework and all the information that the assumption is made that they should have received in their secondary education, in their high school education, but they now have to go back in college. The challenge of that is that now they are paying for it versus on the K-12 system. And so you have students who are paying for their coursework. If they're taking developmental coursework, they're paying for coursework that doesn't count. And so what does that mean? Now you have a student who's then paying tuition, and at the end of the year, they have 3 credits or 6 credits or 9 credits or no credits. Chances are that student who has 3 credits by the end of that first year, they're never going to finish. And they're not going to finish. And the big reason why they're not going to finish is for no other reason, their financial aid will eventually run out. Because even if they were using financial aid during that process and during that time, it's not counting towards actually core curriculum credits that they can put towards graduation. A second reason for many students is the financial. And you look at how that plays into the fact that it isn't just about the cost of college, which is, you look at the fact that college continues to rise anywhere from 6 to 8% per annum when it comes to cost. But it's also the other bigger issue of students not being able to either qualify or complete the work for things like the Pell Grants and the other things that their financial situation merits them for, but they don't have the opportunity to actually qualify for. A third reason for many students is just life gets in the way. You have a family member that gets sick. You get sick. You need to go work because someone in your family lost their job. Someone involved in your family is now involved in the criminal justice system, and you need to go find ways to financially support them. There's a collection of different reasons and things that can happen when we talk about life getting in the way. The thing that I love about the ACE program and what it focuses on in Lehman College, it understands the fact that if you really want a student to succeed and matriculate, you have to deal with all of the life gets in the way stuff. And so we focus on things like the funding of fee waivers and transportation vouchers and tutoring and college career assessment and supports. These are the things oftentimes that will hurt a student or keep them from matriculating as much as anything else. The fact that they don't have transportation or childcare assets. And so you watch how Lehman and the ACE program has been able to significantly, more than double, increase graduation rates by simply putting a model that can focus on these issues, focus on the other things that they know are going to trip up students. And so we're really proud of the fact that this, we put some of the first catalytic capital behind ACE, and now we've continued to watch that model grow, not just in the 4-year, in the 2-year, where it actually started initially with something called ASAP, but now progressing into the 4-year with a program called ACE.
Is that a program that is scalable around the country? Have other institutions reached out about that? Do you know?
Absolutely, and it's one of the things actually we really love about it is that when you're looking at the challenges that ACE and ASAP really covered down on, these weren't New York problems. They weren't Northeast problems. They were not tri-state problems. It's the same type of issues that you see whether you're talking about Maryland or whether you're talking about Florida, or whether you're talking about Texas, or whether you're talking about Alaska. These are the same type of issues that students are wrestling with. Now, each geography is going to have its own flavor. Each geography is going to have its own sense and the things that makes it different. But the ability to focus on the intangibles, the ability to focus on the things that don't always get picked up in a transcript, the ability to pick up on the things that you're not always going to be able to articulate to your professor and have them understand, that is tremendously scalable. And so part of the focus and part of the things that we've been able to do is really think through for all these individual areas, how can we put measurements and levers that can actually address these type of things? You cannot have a strong society unless you have a strong college system there, right? And when I say college system, I'm talking public colleges, community colleges, any forms of higher education. If you look at the state of Maryland as just one example right now, for the state of Maryland, only about 25% of students who graduate from college now will have any form of post-secondary degree in 8 years, right? Think about that. A quarter of students that graduate will actually have any form of post-secondary education 8 years from now. The damage that is doing, not just to that individual, but to that community, when we know the importance of some form of post-secondary education when it comes to addressing and putting people in a place to be gainfully employed for long periods of time for the majority of their life, is huge. And so our ability to be able to smooth that curve, our ability to be able to smooth that transition is something that's a core focus of not just Robin Hood, but frankly, something that we spend a lot of time on when it thinks about this idea of exporting models.
And I want to let everybody watching now, that we are going to get to your questions in a few minutes. We have about 30 minutes left in the discussion. But I want to turn, before we do that, I'd like to turn the conversation toward adults and workforce training, because you are funding a lot of those programs. And this is something at WorkingNation, as I mentioned earlier, that is the focus of our storytelling. We look at programs that are helping lift people up by giving them the skills they need for in-demand jobs. And importantly, Robin Hood has been funding programs in underrepresented communities where those jobs are not maybe readily at mind. But with the right training, people can get these jobs that are family sustaining, above the minimum wage, with benefits. And one of the programs that I was looking at was the non-traditional employment for women, which is it sounds like a great program out there.
It's a fantastic program, and thank you for asking about it, Ramona, because it's one thing that I think the team understands. Like I'm obsessed with how we're thinking about the future of work, and I'm obsessed with it because I feel like everything is going to revolve around that. And it's about much more than just the employment for financial sake, right? It's about much more than just the idea that we need to give people work, and frankly, we need to pay people a real living wage for a long day's work. It's unconscionable that we still can have people who can work a full day's work and still not be able to pay the basics. But saying that, it's about much more than just the paycheck. It's about the dignity. It's about the value. It's about the psychological change that gives to people when they can wake up in the morning and get dressed however they get dressed and know they're going to go out, and what they're doing is going to be added value, not just to their family, but to our larger society. There is a psychological value and a psychological dignity of work that we have to embrace, and we have to be able to bring out in everything and in everybody in the way they address their work. Non-traditional employment for women is a program that we've been funding in New York, where it's really looking at how can we introduce women into jobs that traditionally have not had pipelines for women. So jobs in construction, building trades, transportation, the utility sectors. Jobs where we know that you have not just oftentimes large employment bases, but stable employment bases. And how do we make sure that women who historically have been excluded from those spaces and places now have pathways to be able to enter into that? And so what they do is, it really prepares women for entry-level jobs in the construction and building trades. They go through a 7-week training program, which is called Blue Collar Prep. And really what that program does, it prepares them not only with the skill set, but then it also has a placement aspect. And so the model really aligns with, this idea of workforce development and macro trends that we're seeing, and namely the construction boom for New York City.
There's a lot of green jobs in there too, which is one of the growth areas, 1 million in the next 5 years.
It's amazing, the amount of green jobs. And every time you see cranes, that's jobs. Every time you see scaffolding, that's jobs. Right? And you're right. When we're talking about how exactly can we have a conversation about employment and climate change at the same time, whenever we're talking about a conversation about development and reconstruction and climate change, that's this. And so this becomes a really unique and interesting opportunity to be able to marry a collection of different things that we've got to put real capital and put a real focus behind. And so what happens with New is, you have women who are now entering into these, local trade unions, and they've agreed. The local trade unions have actually been the one to take this on and agreed to fill 10% of new positions with apprenticeship programs for the women from New. And you're now watching, women who are entering into not just a field, but in jobs where you have people who are usually reaching, 40 to 45%, $45,000, increases within a matter of 5 years. You have people who are now making 6 figures, who are leading trade unions, women who now have pathways to not just success, but pathways to sustainability. And so I'm just a very, very big fan of what New has been able to do. And once again, I'm a big fan of scale. And this becomes something that you put philanthropic capital into it early. You let that philanthropic capital become catalytic capital. And then you let the catalytic capital do what catalytic things do, which is grow and expand and eventually just become part of an ecosystem. That is philanthropy at its best.
We talk a lot about local solutions to local job issues. So creating pipelines. So a program like that, working with local government, local businesses, as you mentioned, local businesses, and then educators and nonprofits coming together to create programs that will help a particular community seems to be a value there. And so what is the role of like a nonprofit in as maybe relative to the government in making that happen?
It's interesting because I think oftentimes when people look at nonprofits, they assume, oh, that's great that people are in nonprofits, like they're almost like the side thing. It's so great that I work in a nonprofit, without understanding the fact that actually, so first, to be clear, nonprofits are some of the largest employers in our entire society.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. One in 7 people are employed by a nonprofit.
I think it's second only to retail.
That's exactly right. So we're not talking about like a side sector here. We're talking about something that is one of the largest employers in our entire society. The second thing that people forget when they talk about nonprofits, they're like, oh, isn't it great that you have that nonprofit that's over there? The majority of social services that take place within our society are done by nonprofits, right? So everything from food pantries to after school programs to early childhood programs to senior care to all of those things, nonprofits. What the government does, the government contracts those nonprofits out. The government can make sure they go through the process of vetting and they put together the RFPs and they bring together the nonprofits to do the work. But let's be clear, it's the nonprofits that are doing the work. And so you're absolutely right, where we have this fascinating marriage within our society right now that oftentimes I think people neglect and don't fully appreciate how the private sector, how you have a role that the private sector can do to help not just employ, but also to help fund some of these other various entities. You have these various entities, nonprofit organizations that are really fundamentally doing the work, but also serving some of the large employers. You have government who's serving as a conduit between all of these vast, various elements. And so the ability for all these things to be able to coordinate together, to be able to be able to work in unison, the ability for us as leaders and for all of our leaders to be able to think about this really as this quad pod of philanthropy, private sector, government, and the people. When you can put together a mass and a unison that's really having all of those pieces working to be able to address the needs of a large society, now you've got something special. But you cannot do it by simply thinking that there's one aspect of the society that really serves as some form of secondary component or some tertiary measure. That's not going to get us to where we got to get to, particularly when you think about the individual importance of all of those vehicles in order to make true and lasting societal change.
And that's important too, because I recall, I don't recall the actual figure, but somewhere I read that of the people who are in poverty at any given time, they have been above the poverty line and then they slip back in, and they're above it and they slip back in. And one of the things that I know you're passionate about is trying to create a measurable, sustainable lift out of poverty. And is that good jobs, good education, both? How do we get there? How do we keep people from continuing to fall back down?
Yeah, it's when I became the CEO, we went through a process where we really wanted to do a real evaluation of the organization and what was going to be our guiding star, and we let the data lead us where the data led us. And what the data led us was that it's not just that poverty is there, it's how sticky it is. It's not just that it's there, it's that it's so predictable and generational oftentimes. It's when you think about, we actually have a coordination with Columbia University on something called a poverty tracker. And really what the poverty tracker is, it's a longitudinal study where we stay with about 4,000 representative families and individuals within New York City, many of whom are living below the poverty line. And we really work with them as kind of this longitudinal data set to understand what are the trends that we're seeing within this space. One of the pieces of data that came out of our work with the poverty tracker was that when you think about the amount of New Yorkers, and this is New York alone, who have been in poverty, half of New Yorkers have been in poverty for at least a year, in the past 4 years. Half. Not half of a borough, not half of a demographic, not half of a group. Half of the city have been in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. And so when you think about what that means, it is this idea that part of what we're seeing is it's this it's this accordion. It's this ebb and flow of poverty that exists, because for many people who, even once they sneak out of poverty, they're still so close to the poverty line that singular shocks are enough to knock them right back into poverty. And unfortunately, we're talking about singular shocks that in many cases they have nothing to do with, they're not responsible for.
COVID-19.
Right? Like COVID-19, like a virus that comes in and attacks the most vulnerable in every single way, that it comes and attacks the most vulnerable in terms of our health, that comes in and attacks the most vulnerable in terms of our economics, that comes in and attacks the most vulnerable in terms of our susceptibility, and also this larger fear mongering that then exists within our society. Nobody who was impacted was responsible for COVID-19. But one thing we do know is that the economic shocks that has then tremored through our entire society have been staggering. And so that's why when we talk about this idea of true economic mobility and sustainable economic mobility, that doesn't mean let's make poverty more tolerable. That doesn't mean let's make poverty easier on people. That doesn't mean let's move people to making $26,000 a year, because since they're over that 25,600 mark, which is the federal poverty line, now because they're making $26,000, now they're good, right? That's not what that means. It means, how can we guarantee certain measures of sustainable economic mobility so that for as many people as possible, you can make poverty history for them and for their family?
Before we start taking the questions, you have a book coming out June 23rd, 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. It's about Baltimore after Freddie Gray, and you look at the city through the eyes of 8 different people. But one of the things it feels that at the heart of the book is it's a history of a city, or a snapshot of a city that has a history of racial and income inequality, which basically was tinder for this crisis. So talk a little bit about the book and how it relates to what we've been talking to here.
Yeah, so I'm so excited for this book, and I hope people will go get it and read it and understand the points that I was trying to make in it. And you're absolutely right, where where 5 years ago a 25-year-old African American man made eye contact with police, and after he was chased and arrested, an hour after he was arrested, he was in a coma. And a week after he was put in a coma, he died. And there was weeks of protests that took place in the city of Baltimore, my hometown. And then finally, the weeks of protests culminated where on April 27th of 2015, those peaceful protests were no longer peaceful. And the thing that I noticed, and this was also the same day of the unrest that took place in Baltimore, was also the same day of Freddie Gray's funeral. And the thing that I noticed was this idea and this concept of everyone, that for many people, we were talking so much about the tragedy of his death. And that's real. And there was this conversation about the importance of being able to deal with police reform and the lack of police accountability. And that's real. But also the thing that for me was just as heartbreaking wasn't his death. It was his life. It was the fact that this was a young man who was born months premature, underweight, and addicted to heroin. He was born to a mom who never made it to high school and battled addiction for much of her life. Once he stayed in the hospital long enough to gain enough weight, him and his twin sister, they could leave the hospital. They went back to their home, which is a housing project in West Baltimore. And in 2009, that home and over 400 other homes were involved in a civil class lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead that were inside that house. So we now had someone who was born underweight, premature, addicted to heroin, poisoned by lead. And by the way, at this time in his life, Freddie Gray is 2 years old. And so this idea that people say, well, if people in poverty, they would just work harder. how hard would Freddie would have worked in order to avoid the tragedy that ended up becoming the layers of his life? We have to be able to be honest about poverty and economic injustice in our society. We have to be honest about the role that race has played in that throughout the history of our society. We have to be honest about the fact that we do not have equal pathways to opportunity within our society. And if we're willing to do that, then we are then willing to be able to see measures of sustainable change. We have to have a truly aggressive and progressive vision for what does our society actually look like, a society that every single person has an opportunity to achieve, that every person has a pathway to achieve, and that the only thing that should actually stand between them and their dreams and their hopes and aspirations is the pathway that they then choose. But the reality is we still got a lot of work in our society to do before we actually get there.
I look forward to reading the book coming up in June. So thank you. We have lots of questions here, so I'm going to get to some of them so we can make sure we get them before the end. The first one is, considering the very complex system of education and all the players, if you had to select only one area to work and intervene, what would it be?
Jeez. One area?
Get the tough one first.
Early childhood education. I feel like one of the biggest challenges, and I say this with such humility because it's so difficult to say what's the one area. But the reason I say that is this, is part of the biggest challenge we have is for so many kids, it's where it starts early. And it starts even early. You know, when people think, oh, do you mean like pre-K? No, or kindergarten. No. What I mean is, like, first, let's make sure that we have, babies being born healthy, right? Let's make sure we have babies being born healthy. Let's make sure we're supporting mothers. Let's make sure that we're giving good, both pre and postnatal care to mothers and to families as they're coming on board. But we also have to understand that education begins much, much earlier than a child will ever walk into a formalized environment. We have to remember the fact that the majority of all brain development and all that is happening before they will ever even walk into their first classroom. We have to understand the fact that when they meet their first teacher, that is not their first teacher. That might be their first formal teacher, but they've had teachers all throughout their lives. And so the question becomes, how are we best equipping our instructors and our teachers in every definition of the word to then prepare that child to be able to come in and perform in a classroom? And I'll say this one thing quickly, where if you talk to many teachers, particularly teachers in kindergarten and pre-K, and you ask them, say, what's the thing that you could use more than anything else to be able to help you do your job? Is it more materials or pens or time, whatever the case is? The most frequent answer I've gotten from educators is a classroom full of kids ready to learn. Because if we walk into a classroom and you have such divides of where kids are, when you have some kids that are walking in ready to go and some kids that are walking in and they don't know letters and colors and numbers and the 30 million word divide that we all know for early education, then if a teacher teaches too fast, they will lose the kids that aren't prepared. And if they teach too slow, they will lose the kids that are. And so how then can you do that when you have such a disparate focus and such a disparate preparation level for our kids? And so if I had to pick one area, the area I would say is we have got to get early childhood education right. And we've got to make sure it's a holistic experience that incorporates not just the instructors, but also incorporates the families as real partners in this work.
Another question we have here, are you finding more success working with governments locally or on the federal level? And are there areas that you're finding hope that there will be some changes?
So I'm a firm believer. I think about this from even my own experiences, where when people say, what was the place that you had the most enjoyment, leadership position? And I can tell you right now, the job where I've had the most enjoyment was being a platoon leader in the military. And they're like, it wasn't when you became a captain or like, no, it was a platoon leader, because I felt like that's where you had the most direct connection with your people. Like, I knew all of my people. I knew their names. I knew their family situations. I knew what motivated them, what discouraged them, all that kind of stuff. And I feel when I think about the importance of local government, where in some ways local governments have fewer tools and levers to pull, right? I mean, a mayor can't print more money. for their jurisdiction. A mayor oftentimes is waiting to hear what the governor is going to tell them, or what what Washington is going to tell them about what they have to spend. At the same time, there is a tremendous amount of discretionary thinking about what a mayor or council person or a alderman can do when it comes to addressing the issues in their own local jurisdictions. And so I find the level of creativity that can take place there to be really inspiring and really refreshing. Also, because when you're looking at things on a national level, you need to have so many different test cases to prove before you can go in and actually do something, because you're dealing with such a large population. I think about the work of Robin Hood, right? Where Robin Hood was one of the first organizations to actually put money and start funding needle exchanges. And this is when needle exchanges were like completely taboo. Like, what do you mean you're going to give needles to drug users? Well, the data was showing us that if you're trying to stem the tide, the raise in the tide of HIV/AIDS, that actually one of the fastest ways for transmission was actually the exchanging of dirty needles. So if you exchange clean needles, you can actually address that. A lot of people wouldn't touch it. And so from a foundation, we started working with other groups and also local governments to be able to say, let's test this out. Let's try it out. Let's see if it works. Now, Robin Hood doesn't fund needle exchanges. Nobody does. The reason is because the federal government does it. But the federal government was never going to be first money in on something like that. They needed to see that it worked. They needed to see it could scale. And so I think there's a lot of things that can happen on a federal government side to be able to change things in the stroke of a pen, right? I also think it's important to not forget the leverage and the potency of our local governmental partners and also our other partners to be able to create the pathway for change that is going to be necessary.
And have you changed any of the ways that you're working in this crisis, different approach to partnerships or fundraising campaigns?
Yeah.
You just actually had a very successful fundraising campaign.
We did. And we're thankful that people, despite how how uncertain things are, the one thing that became certain for many people's minds is this is going to hit our communities the hardest. And I think people were incredibly generous, which we appreciate. And the fact that, I was very, proud to lead this effort where you're right, where, it's been reported where in that night where we had our virtual fundraiser, we raised over $115 million. But in many ways, this has changed everything about how we have to think about this work, where when people say, so what does that mean that, that the conversations we're having before were not important? It's like, no, it's important. But what's happened is there's been an increased sense of urgency and an increased sense of insufficiency, right? Because you realize just how complicated and damaged the infrastructure was in the first place. And so by being able to put together new partnerships, for example, we have a partnership that we have with both the Mayor's Fund within New York City, the Black Family, Aramark, that really focused on providing support, both food and other supplies, to healthcare workers. It's called, New York City Healthcare Heroes. And when we say healthcare workers, oftentimes people think, the doctors and the nurses, but it's also for our population, it's the janitors, it's the orderlies, it's the ones who are changing the bed sheet of the person who passed away 15 minutes ago in that bed, right? People who oftentimes were dealing with economic insecurity before all of this. So partnerships like that we're incredibly excited about. The ability to have impacted communities actually influence how we're spending our capital. Where right now we're actually running a platform where we have something called the Design Insight Group, which is really it's 1,400 New Yorkers who are living in poverty, who are on our payroll, who we work with, and they really serve as a test case for how we think about all this work. The reason that it's so important to us is that you don't find any product that goes to market without having UX and UI, right? There's no one who's doing anything in ed tech or that doesn't have people who are testing it out. So we're like, then we need to have impacted communities who are part of our process and part of our grant making, and make sure their voices are heard as well. And so we really have just, continued to push in this moment about how we think about speed. The fact that we've now put out over $23 million in our relief fund alone that's raised over 45. So it's about not just getting the money in, but it's getting it out quickly, and also trusting your community, because they are the ones who are going to know best on how that capital should be used and how that capital is going to best help their families.
This question prefaced by the writer, a left field question. Do you know of any emerging partnerships programs that scale ADUs, affordable housing, to address the looming eviction crisis? It's hard to learn when you're homeless.
It's incredibly hard to learn when you're homeless.
Yeah.
And I think we were talking earlier about this idea that COVID didn't present anything new, but it exposed something broken. This is something that is a perfect example of that. The fact that we had so many college students who were housing insecure, food insecure. I think about the work I'm on the board of Equity, an organization called Equity. It was run by a remarkable CEO, David Helene, and also Sarah Goldrick-Robb. And you think about this work about food insecurity for our college students, and how absurd it is that we have close to 20% of people who are still both food insecure and housing insecure. We actually advocated very early into this crisis for a moratorium on utility shutoffs and evictions. And we were happy to see that, in the case of New York, for the mayor of New York, that they ordered both. We also know this, though, is that this crisis will be around for a while. And that even once the moratorium is lifted, that we're going to have a very difficult time of being able to deal with this long-term impending crisis of evictions and of utility shutoffs. And so, thinking about the work that some of our community partners are doing, such as the Breaking Grounds, and the work of the Bowery Restoration Coalition, BRC, which actually works with this population. These are all areas that we think are not just important and scalable, but areas that are actually providing really important insights and visions for how we're not just thinking about this crisis now, but how we just have to continue thinking about this crisis in the long term.
The last question I think we can get to here is, and I think it's the fitting one. In the beginning of COVID, we heard a lot of people talking about how we will come together as a society because of COVID-19, how it might change the way we look at some of these populations and we look at ourselves. Are you seeing any evidence of that? Are you optimistic?
What I'm optimistic about is I'm optimistic about the fact that I think people are seeing that as not a given. There is this idea and this concept, and you'll hear people say it. They'll say things like, things are going to be better. We're going to be all right. We'll be fine. Says who? And who will be fine? The thing that gives me hope and inspiration is I think we're having more and more people who are actually challenging that premise, because we can no longer exist in this idea that we will be fine is a given, or that we will be fine will be equitable, or that we will be fine is something that is just give it time. We determine that. We determine if we're going to be fine. We determine who's going to be fine. And so how we think about this, and there's a great quote by Dr. King where he talks about, the moral arc of justice is long, but the moral arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice, right? But the reality is that, and it said, the reason that it bends towards justice is because there are people on the other side who are forcing it. They're pulling it. They're making sure we're getting to justice. And so the ability for all of us to not just stand with this "we'll be fine" attitude, and seeing the decrease of that and the increase of the "we're going to make it fine" attitude, that is what's inspirational. That is what gives me, and I think so many of us, that real level of thankfulness and encouragement about where we're going to end up. Because people who are on this podcast now, in this conversation now, I'm not waiting to find out what the answer is. I'm going to determine what the answer is. And that's the approach. That's the mindset that I think we have to take to this next phase. We're not going to wait to see where this thing lands. We're going to land it ourselves. That's the only way that we know we'll get to a landing that feels right.
Great final thoughts on that, Wes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wes Moore, CEO of Robin Hood. Really appreciated you taking time to be in this conversation with me today. And I'm Ramona Schindelheim, Editor-in-Chief of WorkingNation.